We're going to talk about Continental Philosophy this time, and we've done so many talks and so many discussions that dealt with analytical philosophy and empiricism and what characterizes the West generally in our day and has since the scientific revolution, Enlightenment, and so forth. But there's also the European continental tradition, and so we want to look at those, and we also want to offer a critique because they're also very inadequate. And what we're going to find out, as is often the case, there are dialectical tensions. Usually philosophical schools like to try to boil everything down to one single simple solution for everything. And, some philosophers trying to make his case and sell his theories as a means by which everything can be grasped. And that is characteristic of analytical philosophy with, say, Bertrand Russell and the methods of quantification and everything being encapsulated under numerics and tabulation and logic. That's characteristic of existentialism and everything being somehow explained according to the ennui and the difficulties and malleability of man's existence. It's in any of these schools of philosophy, really pragmatism. Everything can be boiled down to the pragmatic and common sense philosophy or whatever. It's always an attempt to have everything explained in some autonomous, rationalistic, or irrationalistic way. And that's across the board. And that's why philosophy ultimately is inadequate. Just reasoning about the world and about man's affairs isn't enough to solve man's problems, to give man hope, to give man a worldview, to give man a template or a means by which to understand and interpret the world. So what we see is that it's kind of a disparate, broken up pieces and fractions of the truth that are in these various schools and philosophers. So sometimes, if we think about, say, the analytical tradition and empiricism, is it all wrong? Well, no. We use the scientific method. It's a great tool for understanding the natural world. Nothing wrong with that. But it's not in itself a grand narrative, and it can't be. If we think about the continental tradition, is existentialism true? Well, there might be aspects to which it holds true. Insights into, man having a context and man being part of a larger situation in which he finds himself as an existing being that informs who he is or determines or limits his freedom or whatever the different existential philosophy might be. There might be aspects of truth to that, sure. So it really just depends on the philosopher and what the claim is and what the propositions are and so forth. And most of the time, when you put a lot of time and effort into philosophy, I've been studying philosophy for about 20 years, you'll notice that it has fragments of the truth in these different positions. Now, that doesn't mean that every one of them is true, and certainly many of them are closer to the truth and others much further away from the truth. So if we want to think about the continental tradition, the first thing that we want to point out is that there are a lot of good critiques and insights in the continental tradition, particularly in the way they approach and criticize the Western analytical tradition. Now, these two guys are of the left, so I'm not advocating this. Those of you who take what I say and run with it to the extremes, when I cite this, one of the things you learn in philosophy is how to deal with other conflicting ideas that are not your own position, and how to interact with them, how to critique them, how to adequately understand them, ideally to the satisfaction of the opponent, if it were in a debate setting. So there's a lot of hotheads and candy asses on the internet that like to talk a lot of crap and take what you say out of context and then run to the extreme, as if, say, citing laboratory life and the construction of scientific facts, for example, that means I'm a Marxist because these guys are leftist, probably Marxist professors. No, it means that I'm pointing out the insight that they have in this book, where they show that a lot of science is constructed in a corporate setting, for example. Now, corporations and professors at universities need money, and they have a certain desire, a pre-planned outcome. So the science that's done is not objective. That's a great insight. It has nothing to do with their Marxism per se. Now, Latour and Vulgar may go too far. I think they do in constructing the idea that that science can't. I mean, really, if you run too far with this, you would get the idea that really science and engineering ultimately, which I think is a better form of science, the hard sciences. Obviously they produce things, so they're not inept. It's not all class warfare or some crap like that. But it's also partly true that science is not objective and neutral, because nothing in our life is objective and neutral. We all have our preconceived biases and misunderstandings, perhaps, which inform the way that we interpret the world. That does not mean that everything is relative. It does not mean that there's no correct paradigms. It just simply means that we come from a paradigm. And what do we mean by a paradigm? A worldview. We have basic assumptions and presuppositions about life in the world that we haven't most of the time questioned. And if we have questioned them, most of the time what we find is that we can't empirically verify them. So does that mean that they're irrational and we can't hold to them or shouldn't hold to them? No, it's just the way that we are. It's the way the world's constructed. It's unavoidable. And so how do we know what's true and what's false? Well, that's why I believe in presuppositionalism, or the comparison of systems. And if you compare the systems as a whole, what you look for is what's coherent and what is consistent and what is contradictory. Now, ultimately, no one has infallibility. Nobody can omnisciently determine for certain how correct someone else's entire worldview is, because we're finite. However, that does not mean that you can't consider relativism. Relativism would say that anything goes, and you can't lay any limitations or binding truths upon me or anyone else. Now, the problem with that is, of course, as we've used as an example many times, it presupposes the thing that it's trying to refute. So at the basic fundamental level of relativism, right, using objective truths, saying that there's objective moral standards, while at the same time you're saying that no such thing exists, is a fundamental contradiction, fundamental flaw at the presuppositional worldview level. So in that regard, we would say that system of thought, even though you might not think of it as a system of thought, it is a worldview, is incoherent. And so when it tries to express itself, which contains within that action of expressing and explaining, of course, the logos has that presupposition of order and rationality and meaning, it cannot do that. So there's a dialectical tension, there's an irrational, rational tension in that worldview at its most fundamental level. And that, for worldviews and philosophy, is very self-destructive and ultimately probably one of the strongest arguments against the position that you have if you're a relativist. So, that's philosophical nonsense. It falls apart. And on top of that, it's not just theory. No one can actually hold to that or live that way. So it's an armchair sophistry that no one in the real world lives according to or expects anyone else to live that way, right? I mean, the person who's the sophistical relativist, generally speaking, gets mad when somebody steals their money, right? Which they shouldn't do if they were consistent with their position, because that guy was just living according to whatever he wanted. So in the same way, we look at other worldviews and we look for the internal contradictions and inconsistencies. And I think that coherence theory is a much better approach to philosophy and to worldviews and to analysis of these kinds of things than it is the older empirical models or the older medieval models of the West with Aquinas, where you do what's called classical foundationalism, and all that's kind of been more or less tossed away and deconstructed by modern philosophy. So we're at a post-postmodern state. And so what do you do then? How is it even possible to critique worldviews? Well, most professors would inconsistently say, no, you can't do that anymore. That's all old school stuff. There's no more grand narratives. Well, I don't believe that. So because I'm Orthodox, I do believe that there's a worldview, a basic pattern of living that informs how I read the world. And it does inform my presuppositions. And in my view, the reason I believe it is not just existential, but also logical and rational. I believe that it's the only logical and rational position that makes sense of my experience, makes sense of history, makes sense of the future, makes sense of meaning, makes sense of most of these philosophical questions that we raise. It doesn't provide every single answer. No worldview out there is going to provide every single possible answer. And if they try to sell you that, that's probably some kind of cult. It's a good red flag for a cult. But I believe that the answers in the anthropology and the metaphysics and on and on and on that we find in this worldview make the most sense. And the other ones that attempt to do that, whether it be naturalistic materialism or something New Age or some sort of cult or Islam or whatever, generally tend to have pretty big difficulties at a fundamental level. Now, that's not to say that there's nothing difficult, quote unquote, in the theology that I hold to that doesn't have to kind of be examined and dug into. And even on a certain level, it's mystical, right? If you think of the great book by Vladimir Lossky, which I highly recommend to people, Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, you'll notice that in our view, theology and the ultimate big questions in the final analysis, they transcend purely rational analysis. Now, that does not mean that they are, quote, irrational or incoherent, because God is not irrational or incoherent. It just simply means that his ways transcend our ways. And so there are at times paradoxes. Now, if you're the atheist or the materialist, you hear that, you say, we've got you. You admit you have no out. You can't answer these questions, therefore you admit that there are paradoxes. Well, the thing is, though, if you read Bertrand Russell, he'll talk about paradoxes. And even Bertrand Russell will say that there's a difference between a contradiction and a paradox. Now, that's a very difficult philosophical question, and that we're not going to go into that today, but I'm just making the point that it doesn't matter what worldview you accept. There are going to be difficulties and problems and serious questions that require an attempt to answer it. If you care to do so. You may not care. Maybe you just want to eat Hot Pockets and play World of Warcraft. But if you want to be a man and put away childish things, as St. Paul says, and engage in manly disciplines, such as philosophy, which is a manly discipline, then it's time to get serious and dig into these things. That's what St. Basil says. Theology is not for everybody. It requires a lot of work. So I've spent 20 years in theology, and the only thing that you come to learn, I'm speaking rhetorically here, is that there's so much more that you don't know. So there's kind of a paradox there involved in the fact that the more that you learn, and you do learn things, I'm not saying you learn nothing, the more that you learn, the more you realize, man, I really missed that. Oh crap, there's a whole thing. Like this last week, there was a whole mystery regarding the incarnation, and this is a subject that I've spent 10 years studying. There's a whole new subject, sort of side, very, very deeply, difficultly debated issue that I wasn't even aware of. So you're always going to find these kinds of things. Now, that doesn't mean that every one of these issues is paradigm wrecking and that it makes you completely destroy your views. It just kind of forces you to answer deeper and more difficult questions. And I think in the mystical experience, as Lossky is kind of trying to get at in his book, is that there's kind of always going to be this greater and greater progression up into the truth, up into philosophy, and up into God. And that's the way St. Gregory of Nyssa characterizes it. You're always going to be learning more and then integrating more is what I'm trying to say. So a lot of times there are apparent dialectics or contradictions or tensions in a philosophy or theology or whatever that just seem maybe irreconcilable at times. Sometimes they are, but in other times you realize maybe 5-10 years down the road, as you progress, you gain more experience, some life experience, some wisdom, and you realize, oh, that's a whole new way to see that problem in philosophy or theology that I didn't know about 5 years ago. So that's just how we're made as humans, and how we're constituted to experience the time-space realm, and as we progress and mature throughout life.